everyone, and welcome to Grow Your Own webinar series, a collaboration between us at Sudbury Shared Harvest and the Greater Sudbury Public Library. So my name is Chrislyn, and I will be hosting today, along with my friends and amazing coworkers, Chanel, Shanda, and Maya. So today, we are talking about backyard composting. I just want to start by saying that there are so many different ways to compost out there. I've seen techniques for producing finished compost in as little as 14 days. I've seen it done on scales as small as kitchen units, all the way up to huge piles like on farms that require huge machinery to turn them. So today we're just going to be presenting some of the more popular backyard composting methods, as well as going over the general decomposition process, which is going to be a lot of fun. So there's so much information out there, and our intention is just to provide a little bit of an overview, hopefully point you in the right direction and stimulate some neat ideas. So in this webinar, what do we mean by composting? We're referring to the process called managed aerobic decomposition. Aerobic meaning involving oxygen. What's great about this type of composting is that the bacteria that live in this environment, they don't really give off much of a smell. So as long as you manage the pile properly by ensuring good airflow, you really shouldn't get much of an odor. This is different than an anaerobic environment, like a landfill, where the microorganisms within this environment give off a really sulfury odor. So composting can be done anaerobically, but for this reason, the odor and a few other disadvantages, which we'll go into in more detail later, we don't really recommend it. But composting can seem daunting, but as long as you follow the steps, even if you make some mistakes, you should end up with some reasonably good compost. So this begs the question, why compost? Well, there's many excellent reasons for backyard composting. First, it's an integral part of regenerative agriculture. So regenerative agriculture is a concept that we love at Sudbury Shared Harvest, and Fiona went into this in greater detail in some of our earlier webinars. But just as a quick recap, regenerative agriculture refers to a method of food growing that's based on conservation and rehabilitation. So it seeks to regenerate the soil's ability to sustain life, and it's focused on increasing biodiversity, topsoil regeneration, and increasing the resilience of ecosystems. And there's a saying in regenerative agriculture that goes, "Don't feed the plants, feed the soil." And this is true because the key to soil fertility lies in the rich organic matter or humus content of the soils. And when you add organic matter that's rich in carbon, nitrogen, or both, like grass clippings or food scraps, to your compost to decompose, you can feed the soil food web. What's the soil food web? Well, here's a picture of some of the living beings that compose the soil food web. The soil food web refers to the complex relationships between the diverse flora and fauna that are found in and around the soil. So there's so many microorganisms and other organisms in the soil. You may have heard this, but this always amazes me. In 1 teaspoon, there are more microorganisms than there are people on this planet. So without this soil biodiversity, there would literally be no terrestrial life on Earth. And these types of organisms, they include the bacteria, the fungi, the protozoa, nematodes, microarthropods, and the larger plants and animals in and around the soil. And we'll go into this in more detail later because we love our decomposers. So anywhere you go, the soil food web is going to look different. This is because the composition of each specific web is greatly influenced by the biological, chemical, and physical forces in the environment. And through the process of composting, we could kind of be like nature's magicians and create the conditions necessary for the emergence of the essential fungi and bacteria that work to decompose our organic matter and feed the plant life. So these microorganisms, they feed the larger organisms, such as the worms, who then make nutrients bioavailable to plants through their nutrient-rich castings. And this adds even more microorganisms to the soil. And so this continues, creating the ideal conditions to sustain plant growth. And that is how we feed our soil. So let's talk about the difference between organic fertilizers and synthetic fertilizers. So composting gives us rich organic fertilizer that's completely different from synthetic fertilizers. And why? Because it actually works to build the structure of the soil over time when you add it to your farms and gardens. So as the organic materials, like the leaves and food scraps, break down during the process of decomposition, this builds the texture of the soil. It improves water retention, and this means that less irrigation is needed, and it also means that less precious soil is lost to wind and water erosion. It also creates a nutrient-rich environment for plant growth. So here's a quote from the Rodale Institute. Organic agriculture can meet the yield and economic goals of conventional agriculture, especially in times of drought. So there's a lot of evidence done by the Rodale Institute and a lot of other research to suggest that organic farming methods, without the use of any pesticides or synthetic fertilizers, have the potential to yield as much as conventional agriculture. And this is because when we use compost in our farms and gardens and use regenerative agricultural methods, we can actually add to the biodiversity of soil life and aid in the disease, drought, and pest resistance of plants. So, synthetic fertilizers, they work, but there are tremendously negative effects on biological life and soil health. So these fertilizers are synthesized through really energy-intensive extraction processes, and they turn rocks, minerals, and petroleum products into bioavailable forms for plants. So adding something like Miracle-Gro to your soil will give plants an initial boost, but the problem is that it does not feed the microbial life of the soil. Plus, the nutrients eventually leach out of the soil, requiring more and more synthetic fertilizers to be applied. It also means that this runoff is ending up in our lakes and rivers, which is causing increasingly frequent algae blooms and posing a hazard to populations of fish and other species. So intensive farming practices, those of conventional agriculture, such as yearly tilling and the use of chemical fertilizers, contributes long-term to a degradation of soil conditions and soil erosion. A new study backed by the United Nations states that a third of the planet's land is severely degraded. Their Food and Agricultural Organization has recently stated that due to soil erosion and soil degradation, we have only 60 years of topsoil left, and half of the topsoil of the planet has been lost in the last 150 years due to these harmful agricultural practices. On top of that, repeated use of synthetic fertilizers may result in the buildup of toxic chemicals like arsenic and uranium, which create a hazard to people's health, not to mention plant and animal life. So another reason for composting is that it diverts food waste from landfills. Instead of your food waste being thrown in the garbage, taken by a truck into a landfill where it takes forever to decompose, as you can see pictured in the second diagram here, it will simply travel from your kitchen to your composter and then back into the earth, ideally, like the first diagram here. So this considerably shortens the cycle and the amount of energy that's required to process your food scraps. Our food waste in Sudbury gets taken to the Sudbury dump, but in some larger metropolitan areas, such as Toronto, waste gets shipped considerably longer distances. So in Toronto, it gets shipped all the way to London. And that's just a lot of resources required and a lot of extra pollution from transportation and processing that's just not necessary if we manage things in an ecologically friendly way. So another staggering fact is that 21% of our landfills are composed of food waste. And America alone throws out 35 million tons of food waste per year. So this is the equivalent to 7,000 dump trucks per day. just of food waste. This is space that could be otherwise taken by non-recyclable materials, so our landfills would not fill up as quickly. But not to mention, the food waste does not decompose nearly as quickly or as well within this anaerobic type of environment. And once in the landfill, it also produces methane, which is a greenhouse gas, which contributes to climate change. And there are ways to turn methane into forms of energy, but these tend to be extremely expensive and not very efficient, especially considering there are much more efficient ways to make use of your food waste. So by composting, we can actually be a really positive part of this process and render food waste into something valuable. It can become an input that can help to regenerate the soil and sustain healthy food systems, closing the energy loop. Sudbury City Composting Program, this is kind of neat, diverted 230 tons of organic waste per month in 2019 from landfills and turned it into publicly available compost. And this is wonderful. But the problem is that regulating the inputs on a citywide scale becomes far too challenging. Therefore, the quality can't really be assured. It has to pass testing requirements, but some gardeners that I've spoken to have reported receiving compost that contains large amounts of plastic and other inorganic materials. Others have had no issue with its quality. It's accessible and it's free nonetheless, and sometimes we just need to go with the resources that are available to us. But if possible, producing backyard compost is best because you can really control what goes into it and get a better product. It also shortens the distance between your waste and its final composted form compared to the city composting program. Another great reason for composting is that growing good compost helps with disease suppression in plants. And there's been a whole bunch of research that's been done about this concept recently. Although it's not a new concept, it's been around for a very long time. So the way I like to understand this is that in humans, we need a certain amount of healthy gut bacteria to compete with the bad kind. And the same is true in soils. Having healthy, microbiologically active soil helps to prevent against pathogens and diseases that target plants. So on this slide, you can see that the exudates of a seed that have been planted in compost are feeding the microorganisms around it. And this creates a barrier between the plant and pathogens. And we don't know exactly how this happens, but it seems it has something to do with the microorganisms modifying the exudates and rendering them less detectable to pathogens. Pretty cool. And another advantage of compost is that it helps sequester carbon from the atmosphere. Carbon that plants take in through photosynthesis is released into the soil as exudates, so sugars, proteins, and carbohydrates, to feed soil and bacteria. That's kind of what this picture shows here. Actually, 40% of these carbon-rich compounds that are produced by the plant actually go into feeding the soil, or the life in the soil, which I just think is amazing. And it really goes to show how interconnected all of life really is. Another way that carbon sequestration happens is as the bodies of microorganisms grow out of this carbon, such as the fungal walls growing thicker, more carbon is stored underground rather than being in the atmosphere. So as the bacteria and fungi grow, they also release bioavailable nutrients to plants, which provide the plants with the nutrients that it needs. So here's this quote that says, "All agriculture sequesters carbon from the air through photosynthesis. But regenerative agriculture ensures more carbon is stored than released, and it keeps the drawn down carbon underground. This effectively reduces the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and increases the amount of soil carbon available for healthy crops." So, atmospheric carbon is currently at around 410 parts per million, and the United Nations have stated that a safe level of carbon is more around 350 parts per million. So the really cool thing is that by restoring the soil food web, we can actually sequester more carbon from the atmosphere. And if this is done at a global scale, we can potentially counteract the effects of climate change. So all of this and so much more is why we compost.
To understand how to make a successful compost, it can help to know more about the overall decomposition process that is taking place, especially when we're doing it the aerobic way. When we're talking about aerobics here, we're not talking about the Jane Fonda videos, although we will need a lot of oxygen for this too. So what is decomposition? It's a process that carries the energy in an ecosystem full circle. This is done through the breakdown of chemical bonds that are formed during the construction of plant and animal tissue. This returns the energy back to the earth, forming a closed energy circle. In this image, we see the roots penetrating the soil to reach the molecules it needs to grow into a healthy tree that can feed other organisms like insects and animals, continuing the circle of life. How does decomposition work? So there are sub-processes of decomposition. The first step is fragmentation. This creates more surface area for bacterial and fungal growth. It's especially important for bacteria, which are significantly smaller than fungi that can penetrate the material more easily. The second step is percolation by rainwater, which helps dissolve and carry chemicals from leaves, leaching them into the soil, thereby increasing bioavailability. This means the amount of an element or compound, in this case nutrients, that is accessible to an organism, like a plant or a fungus, for uptake. The third step is mixing. This is caused by movements of earthworms and other fauna present in the soil that stir the fragments and minerals around, making them even more available for plants to absorb. In general, when looking for a good compost, there's a recipe for success. This contains 5 primary constituents. So the first is carbon. This is the building block of life. The second is nitrogen, a major component of chlorophyll and amino acids, which are the building blocks of proteins. The third is oxygen, which is essential for respiration for all microorganisms living in your compost. Don't worry, we'll get to these guys soon. The fourth is water. The amount of water can also help regulate the final element, which is heat. And all of these elements can help regulate the decomposition rate. So what is the decomposition rate? It's a method used to calculate the reduction of mass over a period of time. So in other words, it's used to see how fast decomposition can happen. This can be affected by multiple factors. The first factor is the carbon to nitrogen ratio. So this is the ratio of mass of carbon to the mass of nitrogen in a substance. For this, I'll be using the example of straw versus hay. On one side, we have straw, which is the dry stalks of cereal plants after the grain and chaff have been removed, meaning it is cut after deterioration. So it's very high in carbon, but low in nitrogen. Hay, on the other hand, is the grass or legumes or other herbaceous plants that have been cut while the plant is still growing. So it's used to feed animals because there's a lot of nitrogen, meaning there's a lot of nutrition. This is why they say hay is for horses. Generally speaking, nitrogen-rich materials have faster decomposition rate than nitrogen-poor materials because fungi and bacteria have enough nitrogen to make proteins to grow and continue the process. So when we're talking about compost, we'll be referring to the nitrogen-rich materials as the green parts, and the carbon-rich material will be referred to as the brown parts. The second element that can affect decomposition rate is moisture. So how much water is too much? Water is essential for decomposition, but too much or too little can slow the decomposition rate. So we want to aim for somewhere in the middle, moist but not quite dripping wet. If conditions are too dry, the microorganisms may not have the water they need to survive. The overall temperature is lower, which in turn lowers the decomposition rate. If conditions are too wet, this can reduce the oxygen present, which can lead to anoxic conditions where the litter production exceeds decomposition, meaning decomposition rate is significantly lower. So this is something we're going to try to avoid. Usually you'll want to aim for something that looks like the picture in the center, which is, like I said, moist but not dripping wet. The third element that can affect decomposition rate is temperature. So the temperature of the soil is very important as it governs the physical, chemical, and biological processes such as seed germination, root growth, and nutrient availability. It also controls the rate of organic matter decomposition and mineralization of different organic materials. The moisture level in soil or compost can help regulate the temperature. When conditions are dry, the temperature When conditions are dry, the temperature is typically lower and the addition of moisture can increase the temperature. An increase in temperature and decrease in moisture, however, will accelerate the decomposition rate. When the conditions for decomposition are too cold, there's a decrease in microbial activity and biogeochemical processes, thereby decreasing the decomposition rate. When temperatures are high, movement of soluble substrates in soil is increased and the microbial activities are stimulated, meaning there's an increase in soil nitrogen mineralization rates and thereby increasing the decomposition rate. The ideal temperature that will increase decomposition rate is between 2 to 38 degrees Celsius. So this is a comfortable range for micro and macroorganisms present in the soil ecosystem. Anywhere above 58 degrees Celsius will most likely kill almost all of the macroorganisms. Decomposition rate can also be affected by the presence or absence of oxygen. So when oxygen is present, we call this an aerobic environment. I like to think air has oxygen in it, so that's a good way to remember it. And when it's absent, we call it anaerobic environment. So as mentioned before, an increase in moisture can lead to anaerobic conditions. Decomposition can happen under both aerobic and anaerobic conditions. However, we tend to favor the aerobic conditions for composting. So this is primarily because decomposition is faster. Therefore, it's possible to use the compost earlier, whereas in anaerobic composting, it might not even be useful until the next season. So this is something to consider when you start building your compost. Another reason why aerobic decomposition is favored when composting are the byproducts. So aerobic composting will release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, whereas anaerobic decomposition releases methane gas as a byproduct. So keeping climate change in mind, methane has been found to be a more potent greenhouse gas, which could help pollute the atmosphere, whereas carbon dioxide being released is not nearly as detrimental to the environment. So overall, the decomposition rate can help us determine how quickly compost can be made, which can help farmers or gardeners generate a time frame for application to their garden. Now, as mentioned before, it is possible to have decomposition under anaerobic conditions, therefore it's possible to compost this way, but I just want to highlight one major point. That is the time frame. So aerobic composting will be ready in as little to 6 weeks, whereas anaerobic composting can take up to 6 months to be ready. So this is why we will be recommending the hot compost method, but you should use whatever you think is best for you. Now that we understand how decomposition works, let's take a look at what's in our soil. So soil is primarily composed of minerals and organic matter. Of the organic matter portion, there are two main divisions. So the first being humus, which is the stable organic component of soil that has been formed by the decomposition of leaves and other plant material by soil microorganisms. The second is the active fraction, and this can be subdivided into two other categories. So we have the first one, the larger one, which is the readily decomposable matter. So this is usually litter, like the detritus or dead organic matter, and all of its constituent nutrients. The second portion, the smaller portion, is the living organisms. So this can comprise the roots of a plant, bacteria, fauna such as arthropods and more, fungi, protozoa, and so many more. So let's take a look at these guys. We call them the decomposers, and the decomposition process would never take place without the A team, that is the decomposers. These organisms feed on dead organic matter, so they're very, very important to the process. Decomposers play a part in every step of the decomposition process and can even help determine the decomposition rate. They're living organisms present in the active fraction of soil and an integral part of the soil ecosystem. Soil biota harbor a large part of the world's biodiversity and govern processes of global importance, such as recycling of organic matter and nutrients. So when we have a soil with high high biodiversity, we will often find different types of bacteria. Bacteria are prokaryotic microorganisms and were some of the first guys to show up to the party, so they're present on almost all habitats of the Earth. Next, we have protozoa. These are single-celled microscopic animals which feed on organic matter. Following, we have fauna. Here, when referring to fauna, we're mostly speaking of smaller organisms like mites, rotifers, insect larvae, snails, earthworms, and so many more. So in this category, we can include protozoa and nematodes. Nematodes are otherwise known as roundworms, and they're not to be confused with earthworms, which are completely different. Lastly, we have fungi. And we all know it's no party without the fun guys. These are eukaryotic organisms that include mushrooms, yeasts, and molds. So let's tackle the fauna first because they're the largest group in the soil. In a natural ecosystem, larger animals decrease particle size and make dead organic matter more accessible for smaller organisms by increasing surface area and oxygenation, allowing for faster aerobic decomposition. We'll see how we act as larger animals while making our own compost later. So these animals are called the megafauna. These are organisms like earthworms, snails, small rodents, reptiles, and more. Essentially, they help kickstart the decomposition process. And earthworms are especially important because they'll aerate the soil, provide room for roots to grow, they'll shred and mix the litter, and they'll also stimulate microbial activity. Next, we have the macrofauna. These are slightly smaller than the megafauna. This can also include earthworms and gastropods, isopods, and the majority of insects. Smaller than this, we have the mesofauna. These are mostly microarthropods such as mites, nematodes, insects, larvae, and more. They help to further decompose all of the matter, increasing bioavailability of nutrients for plants. And lastly, we have the microfauna. This group is mostly composed of protozoa. They are advantageous in the decomposition process because they are larger than bacteria and can withstand adverse soil conditions. They also feed on bacteria, meaning they can help maintain the microbial/bacterial equilibrium in the soil. The other major group that we have are the bacteria. There are many different types of bacteria in the soil ecosystem. However, 5 main functional groups can be named. So first, the most important in the decomposition process is, of course, the decomposers. They consume simple carbon compounds, which is litter, and then convert this into energy that is useful for the rest of the organisms in the food web. They can also break down pesticides and pollutants in the soil and are responsible for retaining nutrients such as nitrogen, preventing it from leaching out of the rooting zone. So there are 4 other groups, but they're not necessarily decomposers. However, they are integral parts of the soil food web, so I thought it would be necessary to go through them. Next, we have the mutualists. These are bacteria that will form a mutualistic relationship with plants. So an example is nitrogen-fixing bacteria, where the bacteria will convert atmospheric nitrogen into ammonia for plants to use, and they store the nitrogen in the plant so that it can be used when the plant begins to decompose. This creates a lot of nutrients for the plants that you're trying to grow. The third is pathogens. These can cause disease, so we're not too big of fans of these guys. The fourth are the lithotrophs and chemoautotrophs. This type of bacteria can obtain energy from other sources like nitrogen, sulfur, iron, and hydrogen instead of carbon. So this is very important for the nitrogen cycling and degradation of pollutants that we don't want in the soil. So the last group is the actinomycetes. This is a large group of bacteria that grows as hyphae, kind of like fungi. They're really good at decomposing hard to decompose compounds like chitin and cellulose and are active at higher pH levels compared to fungi, which are active at low pH levels. So we want to have these guys in there too. Overall, bacteria are primarily responsible for the decomposition of animal matter, whereas fungi are primarily responsible for decomposition of plant material. So fungi are microscopic cells that grow as long threads called hyphae, which push their way through the soil particles, roots, and rocks. They're super crucial to nutrient cycling, water dynamics, and disease suppression. So similar to actinomycetes, They can also convert hard to digest organic material into nutrients for other organisms in the soil food web. They're very important decomposers as they are larger than bacteria and can penetrate areas that bacteria can't reach. And one of the major determining factors for fungal decomposition is moisture, because they produce exoenzymes to digest nutrients, and their movement is dependent on the presence of water. All of these decomposers and many more will make for a very healthy compost that will make your plants happy.
All right, so now on to steps to composting. There are a few steps to consider when making a compost pile, and more specifically when hot composting, which is a process that allows for the rapid decomposition of material. This allows you to use your compost more rapidly. We will be going into each of the steps in the following slides, but in general, the first thing you'll want to consider is what material you will be going to compost. This will help you create a pile with a good carbon to nitrogen ratio, which is essential in rapid decomposition. Next, you'll be turning your compost pile over. This will be a task that can be physically demanding, or it can be made easy depending on the style of composter you choose, which will be explained later by Maya in the following sections of types of composters. Next is the cooling/curing process, which is unique to hot composting and doesn't demand much of you other than your patience. Finally, your black gold or compost can be added to your garden. So your materials. Preparing these beforehand is essential if you want your compost to be completed as soon as possible. Otherwise, you may be always adding new material to your active pile, which will cause it to take longer to decompose. First of all, you'll want to have a good source of brown and green materials. These are your carbon and nitrogen-rich components, which can be found in abundance in either your yard or kitchen, or someone else's yard or kitchen who wouldn't mind giving them to you. More examples of browns and greens will be shown in the next slide. But next, you'll want to make sure your material is broken down before adding it to your compost pile. This helps it decompose quicker since you're creating more surface area available for moisture and bacteria to hold on to. And finally, I recommend having a few tools which will make your job easier, such as trimmers to help break down your material, a pitchfork or a shovel to mix your pile, gloves, a compost thermometer, which isn't necessary, but it does help you determine which stage your compost pile is in, and a watering can or source to keep your pile moist like a run-out sponge, and a wheelbarrow to help move material around. So here's a list of appropriate materials for your compost pile. These might be found in your yard or kitchen, and the only thing you'll have to do is collect them until you have enough to begin your compost pile. Or you might even be able to ask your neighbor for some leaves from their yard, or a local restaurant for their kitchen scraps if you don't have enough of these. Collecting kitchen scraps, though, from your own house or wherever can often be a stinky process. However, you can reduce the smell by separating your fruit and vegetable scraps from your other kitchen scraps and keeping these in the freezer. This will actually benefit your compost pile since it speeds up the process and provides added moisture once it melts. Then you might have a bin with your used coffee grounds or tea leaves kept in a cellar or a cold area, and your egg shells in another container if you have plenty of those. Also, you don't need a huge amount of kitchen scraps to compost. Fresh grass clippings are a great source of nitrogen and also really benefit your compost pile by increasing the heat buildup. So it's also important to note, though, that you don't want to add cat, dog, or human manure into your compost, along with other animal byproducts like oil, fat, grease, fish, meat, dairy, or any chemical products either. And keep in mind also that it is difficult to kill weeds like quackgrass and bindweed, so avoid adding these that have gone to seed in your compost pile just to be safe. So layering your compost pile will help you control the carbon to nitrogen ratio. In general, you want to aim for about 2/3 brown material to 1/3 green material. This will also help the pile have a good aeration and water content. Having more porous material at the bottom will help allow air to get through from the bottom and up, or from up to down as well. And adding water above your greens and manure / soil, which you don't necessarily need to add the manure or soil, but it would help. This will also make sure your dry leaves or other browns don't receive and retain a large amount of water. In general, you don't want your layers to exceed 6 inches, and a 3 by 6 feet tall and wide pile is optimal for heat buildup. Although your pile doesn't need to be filled up to the brim, like in this picture in your compost bin or whatnot, it can be a heap. So it reaches, it reaches the height at the peak of your heap, and this way, in the center of your heap, the heat will build up. However, don't worry too much about your carbon to nitrogen ratio. If you're unsure about it, you will become aware of if the ratio has gone wrong when an odor appears, in which case you can easily fix it depending on the type of odor. So rotten odors like putrid smells or rotten eggs are due to anaerobic conditions where there is too much moisture and compaction in your pile. In this case, add more brown materials, making sure kitchen scraps are covered, and turn the pile over. Whereas ammonia odors are due to a low nitrogen content, and so add more green material like yard trimmings or grass. So your pile will begin to decompose and build up heat within its center, and so it's important to turn it over, moving the central material out and the outer layer in to increase decomposition rates. This also allows air into the pile, which will help it cool down initially, but the microfauna will quickly use up the oxygen to continue decomposition, and the heat will increase again, in which case you will have to continue turning it over again. So it's important to do so when the temperatures rise above 60 degrees Celsius. So this could be every 3 to 4 days if you have a really good carbon and nitrogen ratio in your pile, and this really does help build up the heat quicker. Also, turn your compost pile over when the temperatures fall below 40 degrees Celsius, and remember to also wet your compost if it becomes too dry. So once again, you want it like a wrung out sponge, that type of water content. So in general, check on your pile and turn it over once at least 3 to 7 days. This can be a physically intensive task to turn it over, especially when managing a large pile, but compost tumblers can make this process a lot simpler. So tracking the temperature, hot composting, or also called thermophilic composting, can reach very high temperatures in a few weeks if the pile has a good carbon to nitrogen ratio with proper aeration and moisture content. Having a compost thermometer will help you determine when your compost has reached its peak temperature and is in its thermophilic stage, or when it is slowly cooling down, and also when it's finally in its curing stage. This can also be determined using a rod in which you can stick it in the compost pile for a while or leave it there and pull it out and feel it with your hands to roughly determine its temperature. It's good to monitor the temperature since if it isn't getting hot enough, then your compost will take longer to complete, in which case you should be adding green materials which will help build up the heat like grass clippings or coffee grounds. So depending on how often you're turning your compost pile, its moisture and carbon nitrogen ratio, your pile may begin to cool down by day 14, which would be fast composting, or by day 30, like in this graph, which would be just like kind of normal composting. So this would indicate that the microbes have slowed down their decomposition process and have done the bulk of their work. So it's important to give the pile time to cool down. This is really beneficial for the growth of fungi, which are a key contributor to soil health. The cooling stage will end once the pile has reached ambient air temperature around 15 to 20 degrees Celsius. And this will be when your curing stage begins. So not all processes used to make compost result in compost that requires curing. Although hot composting may lead to the significant loss of nitrogen and carbon and other organic compounds, and so curing allows these to build up again afterwards. In the final stage of thermophilic composting, the microorganisms are diversifying and creating healthy populations which help reduce phytotoxicity and maximize humus levels. So humus is the organic compound in soil, which in nature, for example, on a forest floor, it can take up to millions of years to form. So your organic layer is what you see on the top of your forest floor, and actually that is separated into LFH. So the top layer would be litter, center would be fermentation, and then the last part would be humus. And so that very last part of your organic layer in the forest is humus. And that takes a very, very long time to build up. And in composting, we're just speeding that process up, but still you need to allow the compost to decompose further in order to have humus. So curing can take anywhere from 1 month to a year. A longer curing period yields a higher quality compost with more humus. So you can reap the rewards in as little as 4 weeks if you are a vigilant composter. Otherwise, it can take up to 6 months to a year if you leave it to do its own thing or aren't turning it very often. Adding compost to your garden will offer your soil more biomass and diversity. So this allows organisms to choose what they want to consume to elevate their diversity, biomass, and health instead of us having to figure out what they need/want, for example, by adding fertilizers. If you have plenty of compost to use, then you can incorporate about 20 to 30% by volume of compost into the top 12 inches of your soil. Otherwise, if you have a small amount, you can add some compost into your planting hole so it is easily accessible to your plant roots. And if your plant is already in the soil or your plants are already in your garden, then you can place about a ½ inch to 1 inch of compost above the soil around the plants, or cover your whole garden if you have enough to do so. And this way, the nutrients from the compost will reach your plant roots when you're watering. And when making our compost, we benefit from reaping the rewards while also giving back to the earth. So although it is important that we continue to care for our soil health after adding compost in order to maintain its long-term growing potential, this can be achieved by growing different plant species together and thereby designing diversity into our soil feeding programs. This way, there's no need to try to determine what our soil needs. Instead, we are letting the soil organisms have their free choice by growing a diversity of plants instead of just one. So monoculture agricultural systems are what many people rely on when buying their produce from the grocery store. These systems deplete the soil from nutrients and diminish its structure, rendering it reliant on machinery and chemicals. Polyculture, on the other hand, makes it that the soil is a habitable place for organisms, which then benefit the soil and plant health, the way it has for millions of years without our help. By providing continuous ground cover, it prevents desiccation and erosion also, and it also benefits the accumulation of organic matter. So this is why making our own compost to help grow food for our communities is essential for food sovereignty and fighting climate change. And so here are a few common mistakes that beginners will make when trying their first compost pile. So they often fail to turn the pile over. So this is very important to generate heat. They add the wrong materials. So really make sure not to add any animal products, pet human waste, chemicals, seeding weeds, no diseased plants or no seed cores. Also, the pile may get too wet or too dry. So you want the moisture to be about like a wrung out sponge. And so maybe try not to keep your pile in direct sunlight, although if that's the only area you have, then that's fine. Just make sure to water it whenever you can. and don't put it, I guess, too much in a shady area so that it stays wet for too long. Or like if you have a yard that, accumulates a lot of water when it rains in a certain area, try to keep it out of that space. You can add holes at the bottom of your bin if you are getting a lot of rain or moisture in your compost. And yeah, add a lot of water on hot summer days, or just not a lot, but check on it often, giving it a little spritz here and there. So what to do with your compost pile in the winter? It can be good to keep composting during the winter in order to have a completed compost for seed starting and potting mix in the spring. Not much changes in the method of composting other than the time it will take to have a completed compost. Instead of getting really hot, your pile might freeze. But if your carbon to nitrogen ratio, your moisture and your aeration is right, then it should be okay. This can be hard to keep during the winter too, though. Your moisture, it'll get too wet. Like, those are things you can't really control, but sometimes you can. So having your pile covered will be helpful for insulation and removing the snow, So you don't want to add food scraps to the pile with too much snow under it, or it'll freeze. But also don't worry too much about it. If your compost sits all winter and you don't really add to it, you don't mix it, you might have a few large pieces of materials by the spring. You can always sift it before applying it to your garden. So vermicomposting is also a great way of composting in the winter, and it can be done indoors since it doesn't smell and can be and doesn't need a lot of space. So because you can do it in a plastic container. Worm castings are very rich in nutrients and hold moisture very well, and so this is an awesome planting medium for your garden or houseplant. The best type of worm to use are the red wiggler. These don't burrow and live well in a highly populated area. They also eat about half of their weight of food a day. So if you have 1 pound of worms, then you can feed them about half a pound of food each day. The population can double in size every 3 months, but they won't overpopulate the bin. Also, worms can produce all bacteria that are pathogenic to animals, which is what hot composting does, and is really great. And so both are really great for this.
Hi everyone, I'm Maya and I'm going to go through a few methods that can be used for backyard composting and run through the pros and cons of each system. The most effective compost bin will vary from person to person, and there are some important factors to consider when choosing a composting method. So some of these important considerations include the proximity to your garden. The closer the compost is to your garden, the less distance you have to move it when it's ready to be added to it. This also applies to a water source. Making sure the compost is near enough to a hose so water can easily be added during the process is important. The same goes for a vehicle if materials need to be brought in to build the composting system or add composting materials to it. Placing the pile in an area of partial shade is usually best. The sun exposure will help to make sure the compost stays warm, but putting it in direct sun may cause the pile to dry out too quickly, and so it would need to be watered often. This is also the case for areas with high wind exposure. The pile could dry out too quickly or blow the compost around. The compost also shouldn't have water running directly into it because it could become too wet, like under a dripping eaves trough, and it should have good drainage, so not an area where puddles form. There are also considerations in terms of the size and structure of your compost pile. The dimensions of the pile should be between 3 and 6 feet in height by 3 and 6 feet in width, and the length of the pile may vary. Any larger than 6 feet and the pile may not get enough air to its center, and less than 3 feet may not allow the pile to retain enough heat for proper decomposition and to kill pathogens and weed seeds. Keeping the pile to a manageable size will also be important in reducing the physical work it takes to turn it. It's better to use multiple small piles than to have one larger one. So the first system is a compost bin made from pallets or wooden slats. This method allows for a multiple bin system to be used, where one bin is for adding new, fresh material, one is in the decomposition stage and being turned, and the final bin is for finished compost that's ready to be used in the garden. It's also fairly easy to construct. It can be put together quickly and easily with old pallets or scrap wood. It keeps the compost contained and safe from blowing and spreading to surrounding areas, and the enclosed area will allow it to retain heat for longer, which will aid in decomposition. The disadvantages of the pallet bin are that they can be quite labor intensive. The enclosed space of the bin may make turning more difficult, as users would have to reach over the sides of the bin to turn it. This can be helped by making the bin 3-sided or making one of the 4 sides a door that swings open. The bin is also heavy and not easy to relocate around the garden, and the pallets are sometimes made from chemically treated wood, which could contaminate the compost. It's important to check the pallet stamps to ensure that their only heat-treated wood is being used. The next type of composting system is a cement block bin. This method helps to keep the compost warm longer, as the cement blocks absorb and retain a lot of heat from the sun, which will help the compost to decompose. They're also very sturdy and strong and can make a good permanent composting location. This system also allows for the multiple bin system to be used, as more cement block compartments can be added easily. Some disadvantages include that the blocks can be knocked over easily if not cemented together, but this can be fixed by adding cement. The blocks may also become too hot when exposed to direct sunlight in the summer and overheat the compost, so air vent spaces should be left between blocks. Also, if the bin needed to be moved, relocation may be very difficult as it is very heavy. A wire bin is another option. This bin is very lightweight and easy to set up. It can go anywhere, and a multiple bin system can also be implemented easily. However, it can be difficult to turn as a pitchfork could easily get caught in the wire mesh, and the compost can fall through the mesh openings if they are too large. The bin can be moved by the wind easily if it's not staked to the ground as well. The next system is a straw bale compost, which is a compost bin that becomes part of the compost itself. The straw acts as a brown ingredient. The straw bales will hold together for 2 years before being added into the compost. This compost system doesn't require turning, as decomposition can occur right up to the straw bales and the edges of the pile. However, the process can be sped up by turning. They're easy to build, inexpensive, and they're good at maintaining heat and moisture in the pile while still allowing air circulation. So some disadvantages to the straw bale method are that maggots and flies lay eggs in straw, which can be a nuisance, as well as that grass and other weeds can grow into the straw bales and are very difficult to remove. The composting process also takes longer with this method if the pile isn't turned. So here's the classic compost heap. It's obviously very easy to create because it just involves the composting material, and it costs no money, time, or energy to set up a bin, and it's easy to turn and maintain. Some disadvantages to the compost heap are that it's more difficult to maintain a size and shape that's essential for decomposition, as it does not retain heat or moisture as effectively as an enclosed compost bin. It's also not sheltered from the wind and can spread around and lose its shape easily, and animals have very easy access to it. Using a compost tumbler as your composting method makes turning it much easier and less strenuous on the body. And the tumbler can be moved more easily around the garden as they are often built with wheels. The fully enclosed, dark-colored container keeps the compost warm and allows for compost to be ready quickly. It also effectively keeps animals out of it. Some disadvantages to the compost tumbler are that it's more expensive than building your own bin. It has a limited size, and a multiple bin system would not be possible without purchasing another tumbler. It also requires close monitoring of moisture levels because the bin is completely enclosed and rain cannot enter it. So the last method I'm going to be going over is a simple plastic composting bin. The bin's dark color and enclosed space retains heat well. It keeps animals out, and most bins are built with vents to allow air circulation. They're easier to move than some other methods, and some bins are made with a convenient opening at the bottom to harvest finished compost easily. So like the tumbler, the disadvantages are that it's more expensive than other composting methods and cannot be expanded without purchasing another bin. The moisture levels need to be monitored because it's fully enclosed, and it can be difficult to turn as the only opening is at the top of the bin. Okay, so that brings us to the end of our podcast. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Grow Your Own Regenerative Agriculture at Home webinar series.
Happy